Actually, empathy has a very precise technical sense in Husserl's classical phenomenology. It's not what we find in psychology, it's not what we find in other human sciences, but it has a relationship to all the other concepts of empathy, and it aims to ground the other concepts. The reason is because Husserl uses a concept of empathy as an analytical tool for his critical and radically critical studies of the constitution of sense and meaning. So sense and meaning which makes experience possible. He introduces a concept of empathy for this specific purpose. So in order to study meaning constitution, sense constitution, in two works in the 1920s, in a second volume of Ideas, and it's a very complicated set of works because it's published in several different manners, and then in Cartesian Meditations, both of which remained unpublished till the 1950s. In the first that I mentioned, so Ideas 2, it's here, Ideas 2, it's published as Husserlian 4, and then also as a new edition, Husserlian 4/5. In that work was published posthumously in 1952, and what we find there is a composition of manuscripts by two assistants, Edith Stein and Ludwig Landgrebe, and they worked on Husserl's manuscripts. This first edition is still very controversial today, and the reason is that scholars are debating still today about the trustworthiness of Stein's original reading, her interpretation, and her composition of Husserl's manuscript. So this is a debated issue. Moreover, while Stein was editing this first outcome of Ideas 2, Husserl himself continued refining, clarifying, and defending his early conceptualization of empathy in his manuscripts, and there are numerous of them, some of which were published in 1970s, but some will still remain unpublished. Also, the heavily revised German version of Cartesian Meditation, so this one, came only out in 50s. And thus we are dealing with a theory, a kind of conceptualization, which still demands exegetic work. So it's still a debated issue. It's still not completely clear what we find there. This is just a warning to you. But I will go into my reading and I will present it to you. In Husserl's account, empathy is, to put it short, a necessary precondition for all sociality, all communality imaginable, not just actual sociality and communality, but all communality and sociality imaginable. So it is a necessary precondition for all human sociality, but also more generally, a necessary condition for all other, for the sociality of all other species, actual and possible, so animal species, for example, as well as for the interspecies forms of sociality and communality that we find, for example, in horse riding, in cow milking, in zoological research into the behavior of wild animals such as the primates, whales, crows, so even birds. So this all this has a precondition, and the name of that precondition for Husserl is empathy. In Husserl's framing, empathy, however, is not an emotive relation. It is non-emotive. It's not emotive as such. It's not any form of co-feeling or feeling with the other. It's not that. It's neither projective nor introjective. It doesn't project anything into anything, and it doesn't introject something into me. That's not the case. It results neither from simulation nor from any kind of theorization. It is happening on a level of simple experiencing. Thus, empathy should be sharply distinguished from sympathy, which is much more complicated experience, from compassion, more complicated, and from all levels of fellow feeling, more complicated also. Empathy provides also a condition for the possibility of all such intersubjective emotional relations. It's more fundamental, it's lower in experiencing. Neither should empathy be confused with the activity of understanding the other person's experiences, their mental or psychic states. It's not an understanding of what the other is thinking, feeling, planning. This is not it. In particular, empathy is not any grasping of the content of the other's inner state. It's not a tool to get into the other's mind. It is more fundamentally, and this is for Husserl the most fundamental sense, it is the experience in which we grasp the other as a specific type of being, a conscious one, who can have such states or mental states in the first place. So it is an experience which distinguishes the conscious beings in our experience from all other beings, such as a pen, a mug. So if there would be a fly flying around in my environment, then empathy would be the name of the experience that distinguishes this conscious living being from the other things that I find in my environment. Empathy thus relates us to an alien consciousness, but does not reveal, it doesn't reveal the contents of the other's mind. Rather, these contents remain inaccessible to us and sealed off from us in empathy, in simple empathy, unless the other is willing and able to express and communicate them to us. So in order to get into the contents of the other state, we need also expressive and communicative experiences in addition to empathy in Husserl's account. This entails that for the grasping of the content of the other person's inner psychic or mental life, something else beyond mere empathy is needed. That is, communicative acts, which are also called social acts in a proper sense of the word. These are acts which firstly, so in addition to empathy, they firstly intend the other not only as a conscious being, but also as an interlocutor, as someone who is able to address me and whom I'm able to address in expressive exchanges. And second, it also, so communicative acts also entail that we aim at communicating contents across space and time. We have to have the intention to deliver the contents or receive them. If we have no such interest, there is no exchange of contents. Thus, communicative acts are needed to contribute to the exchange of contents, and they depend on empathy. Empathy doesn't depend on them, so it's more fundamental, the empathetic level. Communicative acts can be either linguistic acts, proper, or else they can be acts that enable gestural communication, so non-linguistic gestural communication. And this means that on the basis of empathy, we can intend also pre-linguistic and non-linguistic others, such as infants and animals. And we intend them as gesturing interlocutors and come to grasp and understand the contents of their experiences by gestural expression, not linguistic. Husserl and his followers argued that empathy, thus defined, is a sui generis form of intentional experiencing. So, to be sure, it bears important similarities to other forms of intending, most importantly to perception, recollection, significative intending, so sign language use of signs, and picture consciousness. But it is not a subspecies of any of these, nor is it a synthesis of any of these. It is a sui generis form of intending. This is emphasized eloquently by Edith Stein, who was an editor of Husserl's ideas too, as follows. And I have another slide, sorry. The subject of empathized experience, however, is not the subject of empathizing by another. And this is what is fundamentally new in contrast to memory, expectation, or fantasy of our own experiences. So empathy is different from memory, expectation, and fantasy. These two subjects in empathy are separate and not joined together as previously by consciousness of sameness or continuity of experience, which happens in memory. You are similar, you are the same self than the one that you remember. But in empathy, a separate self is encountered. And then she continues, and while I am living in the other's joy in empathy and sympathy, I do not feel primordial joy. I empathize with the joy. I don't have to be happy myself. It does not issue live from myself, so this joy, neither does it have the character of once having lived like remembered joy. But still, much less is it merely fantasized without actual life, unquote. So this was just to emphasize that that empathy is not a species of memory, not a species of perception, not a species of imagination, but this is a sui generis form of intending, relating to the other, to anything. Husserl's basic conceptualization of empathy profoundly influenced 20th century phenomenology. And it is still central to phenomenological investigations into intersubjectivity and communality today. It explicated the ground idea, which was further elaborated by the realist phenomenologists such as Edith Stein or Max Scheler, and later by the French existential phenomenologist, most importantly Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Further, via the latter, so the French existentialists, empathy, the idea of empathy, laid ground for a series of radically ethical and radically political philosophical discourses on intersubjectivity. Most importantly, Emmanuel Levinas' discourse on justice, Simone de Beauvoir's discourse on equality, and even Frantz Fanon's discourse on violence, racial violence and non-violence. So it has a very large influence. And that's the reason that I think it's worth looking into it. Husserl's followers did not, however, accept his conceptualization without critical revisions. They were critical. They developed alternative accounts on the basis of his formulations and discussions. Thus, today, we do not have any one phenomenology of empathy, but have several mutually related, both agreeing and disagreeing phenomenological account and conceptualizations of empathy. Actually a great variance. I skipped something about Heidegger. I can send you the paper. It's just a point that he very outrightly rejected Husserl's approach. So we have a very different kind of phenomenology if we follow Heidegger. And there is not, empathy is not in a central position there. So it's a kind of alternative approach within phenomenology. In order to get at the core of Husserl's technical concept of empathy and the types of meaning and sense clarifications and analysis that he is able to perform with this concept, one needs to first familiarize oneself with the architectonics of his philosophical inquiry. So if we don't look into what he's trying to do, we can't kind of follow him. It's too complicated. So I will give you a short account of what he's trying to do. The ultimate goal, his ultimate goal, is a general theory of reason, and reason in its three dimensions: theoretical reason, axiological reason, so evaluative reason, and practical reason, reasoning about goals and means. This aim also entails critical analysis of the passive grounds of reason. So reason has a passive grounding, and also in three modes. So we have to also look into sensations, drives and instincts, and feelings. If we want to kind of grasp how reason operates, we have to understand its passive grounds too. The necessary condition for such a self-reflective reason that tries to reflect itself, a theory of reason, is a theory of knowledge. and the sciences. So an epistemology, which accounts for all sciences, not just for the empirical sciences that proceed a posteriori, but also for the a priori sciences, the eidetic sciences, that we deal with idealities of different sorts, such as numbers, they are not realities, they are idealities, logical forms, for example, linguistic meanings, ideal structures of experiencing, and the ideal values of truth, goodness, and truth. Beauty, goodness, and truth. Husserlian phenomenology therefore begins as an analysis of all sciences and demands a radical reform of their structures. It includes logic, ethics, axiology, and praxis, the natural sciences and the human sciences, the deductive sciences and the explanatory sciences, and the descriptive and the normative one. So it's a universal theory of science. It aims to be. And still we are very far from empathy, but we are coming nearer and nearer, because Husserl contends that an epistemology that he plans can only be established on a radically critical philosophy of meaning and sense constitution. So an epistemology as if demands a philosophical semantics, a theory and an analysis of sense and meaning, how they are constituted for us. One of the leading questions of such first philosophy then concerns the meanings and senses that are able to articulate our experiences. So what kinds of meanings are involved in human experience and in experience in general? More precisely, how are manifolds of meanings constituted such that they can structure experience, all possible forms of experience, of which human experience is one particular type? By what kinds of operations does sense and meaning arise or is established, and with what kinds of results? Moreover, such fundamental meaning and sense inquiries and also entail mereological questions, so questions about parts and wholes, that concern the constitutive order of and dependence relations that prevail between established meanings and senses. Just to give you an example, a pen, we can experience this. The question is, what kind of sense and meaning has to be operative for such an object to be experientiable versus the fly that goes around in space? What kinds of meanings need to be there for these two experienced realities to be given to me? What kinds of meanings are necessary for such experiences? Now we get near to empathy, because from Husserl's point of view, or the point of view of his inquiries into empathy, the most important dependence relations between senses are the following, and I show them to you. And this is really kind of, this is kind of like, wow, because empathy sounds like a human phenomenon, but it turns out to be the world-establishing phenomenon for Husserl. I skip these. I go into order of sense constitution. The highest sense that is needed for epistemology and theory of science is the objective world of the natural sciences, independent of all forms of subjectivity. That's the highest sense that is operative there in the sciences, in a mathematized natural sciences. But this sense, the higher sense, this sense depends on a more primitive sense or a more basic sense, the real world of intersubjective experience. It's not the mathematized objective world of the natural sciences. It's a very differently articulated world. This is more fundamental in terms of meaning constitution. This is dependent. And in order to get from here to here, we need very specific operations that are necessary. Abstraction, idealization, formalization. This is a ground. We go here by these operations. But this sense is not self-sufficient. It depends on other senses. It depends on the sense of other subjects. It's a world of intersubjective experiences. We need the other subjects to have this sense. So the real world of intersubjective experience, that sense is constituted on the basis of the sense of other subjects. We go from this lower sense, this more basic sense, to this higher one by communicative acts. This is not a self-sufficient formation either. It depends on a more primitive sense again, and that's a sense of my moving and living body, in German Leib. So the living body in moving and sensing. Again, constitution proceeds upward, and here empathy is needed. So in Husserl's system, empathy is the type of operation that brings us from the sense of my sensing moving body to the sense of other selves. And these both are needed for the sense of real world, which then makes possible the constitution of the sense of objective world. So empathy is not a small issue in this philosophy. It's an issue on which reality, objectivity both depend. And that's why it has Husserl gives it a very great role in his reflections. And the sense of the living body, it too is constituted on the basis of tactile and kinesthetic sensations. And we need a certain form of apprehension in order to get from this more basic level to this higher level. So this is the order of constitution. I wanted to show it to you for you to understand why empathy, empathetic apperception, it's a technical term, again, don't care about it, but it's empathy for us. Why it's so central for all Husserl's investigations. So I proceed. Husserl's analysis of empathy aims to answer the question, how is a sense of another living being established for us in experience, and more fundamentally, how such sense can be established in the first place for any conscious subject at all. So it's not only us here or us humans that are the issue. He tries to answer the general universal question, how can anyone ever experience another experiencing self? Be this anyone a god, an angel, an animal, an extraterrestrial, or whatever. Let us consider a concrete example. Let us imagine that we are turning over soil in a garden in order to make holes for our summer roses. When we mold the ground in this manner, so digging into the ground, it often happens that we detect quivering movement among the falling clods. So there is something that quivers among the earth that falls. Such quivering stands out immediately in our perceptual field. And we switch from perception of mere matter, cloth of earth, to perception of a living thing. We don't have to be able to identify it. It could be a worm, a millipede, whatever, but we see immediately that something else is there than earth. A contrary switch happens, for example, when we have captured crayfish in a bucket and study them in order to detect dead individuals. We can distinguish lifeless animals from living ones simply by their motions. In a small bucket, all bodies move, but the dead ones move in a different manner than the living ones. Rather than being an inference, a simulation, a change from one type of experiencing to the other and back resembles a Gestalt switch. It's not an inference, it's not a simulation, it's not a projection or interjection. It is a Gestalt switch, a re-articulation of the materiality of our experiencing. Husserl argues that such Gestalt switch, and don't take it too seriously, the term Gestalt switch, necessarily entails a transfer of an already constituted sense from the experiencing subject to the experienced object. The manner in which the subject articulates the sense of her own being in the world, so how I articulate my being in the world, is transferred over to another being, which the subject merely perceives in her environment, and which she does not feel or control as she feels and controls her own living, functioning body. So I have the sense of my being in the world, and it's informed by my sensing and feeling. And I detect in perception the fly, and I transfer one sense onto another sense. More precisely, the sense of living is transferred over from one's own body to a body perceived in the space, in environing space. The transfer results in the establishment of a new sense, that of another living sensing being, another being similar to me in its living, conscious, relating, but separate from me, not me. Hey, how much time do I have? Because I have to, how much can I read still?
2 minutes to start the questions and answers, but
okay.
you can.
Yeah. Okay. I just then skip some sections and just summarize what I wrote for you. What happens is that the transfer is grounded on a perceived similarity between the movement of the object there in a space, be it the fly or the person in therapy. That thing moves in a specific manner, and the movements of my own body. So there is a similarity between two manners of moving. Movement is crucial here. And the similarity allows us to establish a pair of two similar beings. And the pair then operates as a bridge across which I transfer the sense of living to the other, which moves in an analogous manner as myself, as I myself move. The transfer then happens in both ways. I transfer the sense of living there, but at the same time, the sense of a mere object is transferred over to me. So my body, myself, my being in the world receives from the other the sense of an object among other objects. I need this sense from the other. He gets a sense of living from me. Husserl calls this transfer of sense the establishment of a new sense, empathetic apperception. So we get a new sense. We had the sense of own living body, but now we have the sense an alien living body there in space, separate from me. And Husserl repeatedly stresses that this is not based on any kind of reasoning, interference, or interpretation. This happens in experience on a level of simple experience, and what it is a re-articulation of sense, re-establishment, constitution of a new sense. And both the other and myself, we get new sense from one another. In addition to this establishment of sense, we need to be able to confirm that this sense is a correct one, and give it to the other again and again in an evidential experience, verified experience. And that is based on the continuation of the body. It continues its behavior and its movement in a certain way. And this continuation of the movement, manner of moving, then confirms that the constitution was a correct one. The kind of giving sense was something that we can defend. Perhaps I have no time anymore. No.
We don't have comments or questions for the
so
moment.
Perhaps,
so you can continue.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I say three things because I think these are important. These are not often emphasized, so I want to emphasize. Three points deserve emphasis. The first is, or perhaps 2 points. Let's say 2 points. First is that the similarity that is needed So the manner of moving has to be similar. But the similarity can be very minimal. It's not required that the other's body form is similar to mine. It's not required that all manners of moving are similar to mine, or that they are constantly similar to mine. And because of this minimality, then Husserl argues that we can empathetically relate to all kinds of beings, not just to other human beings who share our body form, but also to different kinds of animals, even to robots and mechanical dolls. We are able to empathetically relate to them. What is missing in the case of the latter, so mechanical dolls and robots, is a verification. Because when we observe them for a longer time, more detail, the empathetic transfer is disappointed, because the mechanical doll does not, in its movements, is not similar to our own movements in a necessary quantity. So there is only a kind of periodic similarity, or a similarity which is not rich enough. The second thing is that we don't have to take our whole humanity and transfer all kinds of movements to the other. We can also take parts of our own movements. We can kind of focus on very partial movements in our own case and transfer that sense to the others. And this allows us to, in a similar way as I mentioned, to relate to all kinds of beings, very different kinds of beings than human beings in an empathetic manner. Also to imagine very different kinds of beings and construe different kinds of simulations to human subjects. So the kind of minimality of this similarity that needs to be there allows, in Husserl's account, empathetic transfer to a great variety of beings, but it also allows us to construe simulations of human movement and human mental life.